Henry VIII was a wild young man. Like many spare royal children, most of the pressure was off of him and placed squarely on the shoulders of his older brother. Arthur was the eldest of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. He was the hope of the newly established Tudor dynasty. Elizabeth, his mother, was the daughter of Edward IV, the Yorkist king. His birth united the Lancasters and the York lines, giving the Tudors a much needed legitimacy. He even had the most kingly English name, Arthur. Henry VII had wrestled the throne from Richard III when the latter was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field, ending the Plantagenet dynasty. Henry VII's hold on the crown was questionable, but Arthur would have a solid claim. Planning for the future of a dynasty, at age 11, Arthur was betrothed to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the powerful Catholic monarchs of Spain. Meanwhile, Henry VIII, he was free to live life. By all accounts, that's just what the young prince did. What could go wrong? Welcome to History is Criminal. I'm your host, Mick Biddick, and with me, as always, is the lovely, unqualified, and unapologetic Kimberly Biddick. Hello, Kimberly.
Hey everyone. While you're listening, remember, I don't like history. I married into this. I'm just here to bring the sass, ask stupid questions, and point out that depending on who you are, you can get away with pretty much anything. Let's dig into the dirty past. Again,
In this episode, we'll take a deep look into the death of Anne Boleyn. Was she a young woman manipulated and exploited by men scrounging for power? Or was she a manipulative vixen hoping to grab the reins of power for herself? Then there's her husband, Henry VIII. The image most of us have is likely of an overweight older man chowing on a turkey leg. But Henry was far more complicated than the caricature we think of. Just how these two would get together is a twisted tale that would alter the history of the Western world. Just a few years after Columbus's first voyage to the New World, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain agreed with Henry VII of England to have their children marry. Both kids, Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, were babies when the negotiations started, and 10 and 11 when the marriage was agreed to. When Catherine turned 16, she was shipped off to England to marry the 15-year-old Arthur. The teenagers were wed less than a year later in 1501. It was far from a happy and long marriage. By March of 1502, Arthur was dying, and on April 2nd, he was buried. This put Catherine in an awkward situation. As the wife of the late heir, there were multiple options, and none of them good. She could return to Spain, only to be married off to another noble, but a once married princess, it would most likely not be marriage to a future king. Then there was the option of a convent. The very devout Catherine might have even preferred this option. But there were also politics to think of. The marriage to the King of England was a win-win-win. For both Spain and England, it gave them an ally at a time when European powers were getting ready to carve up the New World. And for the Catholic Church, the union of two powerful Catholic nations would slow the growth of Protestantism. Now, with the heir gone and the marriage over, that win-win-win was questionable. For Henry VII, there was also the question of Catherine's dowry. He didn't want to send all that money back to Spain.
that's rude. So your husband, my son, is dead, but I want to keep all your money. What to do? What to do?
Well, luckily, he had one other son, younger, healthier, athletic, handsome, about 6 foot tall, with a wild streak, Henry VIII. So 14 months after Arthur's death, Henry VIII was betrothed to Catherine. Now, they'd have to hold off on the wedding due to the fact that Henry VIII was still a little too young to get married. It was a 3-year engagement that ended with the wedding getting called off. It seems that Dad Henry had lost interest in an alliance with Spain.
In other words, I spent all your money, so you can go away now.
Eh, Catherine once again was in a weird state of limbo. But when the older Henry died in 1509, the new Henry, Henry VIII, married Catherine anyway, and the two were crowned in a dual coronation. But all was not smooth in the kingdom. The first major hurdle the couple had to face was that under the Catholic doctrine, it was unlawful for Henry to marry his brother's widow. It actually comes from the Old Testament, which states that if a man marries his brother's wife, they will be childless. They decided to claim that Catherine and Arthur had never consummated their marriage. Henry was able to get the Pope to agree and to annul the marriage. The next problem was that Henry had a very wandering eye. Of course, this was to be expected among the nobles of the 1500s, but for Henry, this had become more of an issue. Then there was the problem that Catherine was having serious trouble producing an heir.
Back to the Old Testament and the realization that you cannot fool the Almighty.
It's a horrible, sad story. Her first child was stillborn. Then they had a son that lived for 52 days. Then a miscarriage, a second son that only lived a few days. Catherine then gave birth to a healthy daughter, Mary, her only child to survive. Records show that Catherine might have become pregnant two more times, but both miscarried early in the pregnancy. Henry and Catherine were crushed at the lack of a male heir. Catherine, largely because of her devout faith, remained loyal to Henry. Henry, on the other hand, was far from faithful.
Probably use the old excuse of, well, I need a son to carry on my name. That's a guy thing.
Hmm, you're pretty close to the truth. Young, dashing, rich, a champion in the tournaments, great horseman, and of course, king, he could have any woman he wanted. And he did just that. His many mistresses were no secret. Catherine would not only have known Henry's affairs, she would have known the women personally. Many were her ladies in waiting. Catherine would have to see Henry's mistresses on a daily basis and act like it was no big deal. Two of the young women to catch Henry's eye were the Boleyn sisters, Mary and Anne. They were both educated, sophisticated women, and in many ways they were the opposite of Catherine. While Catherine was a devout Catholic, pious, and could often be found in prayer, the sisters, having spent much of their early years living in the French court, developed a love of music, poetry, and literature. Anne had also started to take a great interest in the religious reforms that were taking place on the continent. The sisters were remarkably educated and forward thinking. It was Mary that first caught Henry's attention, and Mary was very receptive. But it seems that Mary's eagerness to be with the king was outdone by Anne's willingness to hold the king at more of a distance.
Oh, honey, classic move. Nothing gets a man foaming at the crown like a woman who's just out of reach. Mary brought the welcome mat, but Anne had him a locked door and a smirk. And suddenly he's wanting what he can't have.
Mhm. In his 30s, Henry was still an impressive figure, tall, lean, and powerful. He was most likely not used to women rejecting his advances, and when Anne flirted with Henry but didn't let it go any further, the king became obsessed. It should be noted that contemporary accounts don't paint her as the most attractive woman. Some of this can be attributed to bashing by her political rivals, even saying that she had multiple moles and maybe an extra finger on one hand. However, it seems that Henry was actually more attracted to her spirit than her beauty. But he was still married to the now 42-year-old Catherine. When Anne finally gave in to Henry's advances, she had become pregnant. Henry was by this time desperate for a boy and thought that the younger Anne could produce a male heir. Medical science of the day was kind of clueless on the whole how the human body works and thought that, well, she was young, strong, and healthy, so obviously she would have a boy. He secretly married Anne sometime in January of 1533. This would ensure the legitimacy of a child, removing any obstacles to them later taking the throne. One big problem: he was still technically married to Catherine.
Let me guess, he's the king, so that doesn't really matter.
Well, it was 1533, and the king needed the blessing of the Pope. This is where Henry starts to show his ability for some mental and legal gymnastics with the aid of a lawyer named Thomas Cromwell. He claimed that his marriage to Catherine was never legal because she was his brother's wife, and the church forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. It seems that, surprise, Catherine and Arthur did consummate their marriage. So he and Catherine were never really married, so Henry was free to marry anyone whom he wanted. Catherine, however, was sticking to the original story. Both Henry and Catherine appealed to the Pope. Henry asking that the marriage be annulled, and Catherine asking that the marriage be upheld. Catherine did have an ace up her sleeve, however, her nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. It turns out that Charles didn't want to see his aunt tossed aside because of the whims of Henry and his inability to keep it in his pants. The Pope refused to grant annulment. Henry was now in a tight spot with the bigamy and all, and so he granted the Archbishop of Canterbury the power to issue annulments. For reformers and power-hungry nobles in England, this was the chance they'd been waiting for, a break with the Church of Rome.
Now, that is really rude. He ignores the Old Testament to begin with when it suits him, brings it back when he changes his mind, and then changes the law so he can get with his, I'll say mistress, but that's not what I'm thinking.
Hmm. Now, earlier it would have actually been very unlikely that Henry would ever break with the church. He'd been granted the title of Defender of the Faith in 1521 by Pope Leo X because of his defense of papal infallibility in the face of the right of Protestantism. Now, this is actually interesting because he was defending the fact that the Pope, as an emissary of God, cannot be wrong. Now he's saying the Pope is wrong, so I'm going to have to break away from the church. Of course, the next Pope, Paul III, took away this title when Henry broke with the church. But then, oddly, Parliament voted to restore the title in 1544 when England was now Anglican and not Catholic, which, of course, begs the question, what faith is he the defender of? Now, no longer answering to the Pope, Henry was able to send Catherine off to some damp old castle with the new title of Princess Dowager of Wales, a callback to her marriage to Arthur, who was the Prince of Wales. She was also separated from her young daughter Mary and not allowed to return to the court. She would die only 3 years later. Henry and his new queen, Anne, prepared to welcome their new baby. Henry, who was just sure that the failure to produce a boy was all Catherine's fault, knew that this was going to be a boy. Announcements were made welcoming a new prince. Names were picked out with Henry and Edward topping the list. Then, on the 7th of September, 1533, only 3 months after the end of his marriage to Catherine, Princess Elizabeth was born. The celebration was nice, but scaled back.
Serves him right. And as science would prove later, it is all his fault.
Mhm. And Anne was pregnant again by January of 1534, but miscarried. In 1535, she was pregnant once again. This failure to carry a child to term would be extra tragic. Henry was now close to 45, and Anne was somewhere between 34 and 29. It seems that the birth date of a woman who would have a massive impact on the history of the world wasn't important enough to write down, causing sources to vary here. The point is, they might have not have too many more chances. And let's be realistic, few things are as dangerous as giving birth in the 1500s. Well, there might be one thing more dangerous.
A man all upset because he doesn't have a son to carry on his name.
Something like that. Despite being solidly middle aged, Henry was still an impressive man and an active sportsman. It would seem logical that you wouldn't have the king running off taking unnecessary risk, especially without that male heir you're so dying for. Just two girls, 19-year-old Mary, the daughter of Catherine, who was being raised away from her mother, and baby Elizabeth. But Henry had to take part in the tournaments, and chivalry dictated that if you fought the king, you didn't take it easy. And it was that Henry found himself in a jousting match in 1536. The two riders tore towards each other on horseback at breakneck speed, lowering their lances to make contact. The crash would have sounded like a car wreck, with lances shattering, armor slamming to the ground. As the dust cleared, Henry lay on the ground motionless, with his horse on top of him.
Ouch.
Spectators rushed the fallen king to find him unconscious and not breathing. Though he would start to breathe shallow breaths, he remained out cold for over 2 hours. He had suffered wounds, including a traumatic head injury and a large laceration on his leg. To those present, it was clear the king was soon going to die. When Anne was told that Henry was either dead or dying, she went into hysterics. She and many others believed this caused the miscarriage of her current pregnancy, which turned out to be a boy. Henry came to, but never fully recovered. Most likely, the impact teamed with being starved for oxygen for a time left Henry with a brain injury. Those around him noticed a change in his personality. The once energetic, fun loving Henry was now darker with a paranoid streak. The leg injury never healed correctly and festered in oozing on and off for the rest of his life, robbing him of his favorite activities. The king, he used to play tennis for hours, ride on 6-hour long hunts and fights in tournaments, was now unable to keep up with most physical activity. Unfortunately for Henry and many former athletes, he still had the appetite of a man used to burning thousands of calories a day. He was now heading towards that image we have of the round faced, big bellied tyrant. But first, things were going to get really bad for Anne. It was more than producing a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty that Anne worried about. The failure to produce a boy actually put her life in danger. Power hungry men saw this as a chance for them to get closer to the king. The Boleyn family had profited greatly from Anne's ascension to the throne. If Anne could be removed, others could take the place of the Boleyns at court. And Henry wasn't doing his wife any favors. Henry had started having an affair less than 1 year into his marriage with Anne. Unlike Catherine, who had seen the affairs as a part of the normal royal marriage, Anne was enraged by Henry's promiscuity. To Henry, this was totally an unreasonable reaction. He even had the nerve to blame his affairs on her for not giving birth to a male. Her jealousy and his inability to understand why she was jealous caused the marriage to fall apart. After the miscarriage of 1536, the one possibly caused by Henry's accident, he started to make a plan to get rid of Anne and replace her with his new mistress, Jane Seymour, not to be confused with the still very much alive British actress with the same name. Jane was one of Anne's ladies in waiting, if you see a pattern here.
I would say that powerful men back there were horrible, but I'm sure that holds true for today too. Men creating laws and changing them just to benefit themselves and their pockets.
Well, he not only changed the law, he changed an entire country's religion to do that. Enter the story again, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was a powerful player in the court that had helped Henry with his annulment to Catherine. For a time, Cromwell had been one of Anne's major allies, out of necessity, not loyalty. Born the son of a blacksmith, he was determined to move beyond his working class roots. He was, at his heart, a devious opportunist who would use anyone to advance his own interests. The two had a very public falling out. It seems to have started when Henry shut down all the Catholic monasteries in England, taking the money. Reportedly, Anne felt that money should go to charity, but Cromwell and others thought the money should go to the crown. Ultimately, the alliance was shattered when Anne, in the heat of an argument, said to Cromwell she would like to see his head off his shoulders.
Probably not a wise thing to say.
I guess when you got the power to do it, too. But to Cromwell, it wasn't personal. As long as Anne was Henry's first choice, he would toe the party line and play nice with the Queen. But when Henry's favor swung towards Jane, so did Cromwell's loyalty. Anne was no pushover, though. She had brought down other men who had crossed her, and Cromwell knew she could be dangerous. It was clear that Henry and Cromwell needed a solid plan if they were going to remove Anne. Not producing a male heir was not grounds for divorce, even if you're the king. And he couldn't pull the old your marriage wasn't real thing like he did to Catherine. They needed something legal, undeniable, that would take down the queen and clear the way for Henry to marry Jane. For Cromwell, this was about betting on the right horse. If he could once again be of service to the king in getting rid of another wife and making way for a new queen, then he would surely benefit from that.
This is exactly why history makes my blood boil. It's just a long, dusty scroll of powerful men treating women like speed bumps on the road to their next ego boost. Oh, can't annul this one. No worries. Let's ruin her life legally and call it justice. Cromwell wasn't betting on the right horse. He was shoveling dirt over a woman to clear the path for Henry's next midlife crisis in a corset.
Anne wasn't helping her cause. She had always been outgoing and flirtatious. She enjoyed the company of men and really liked their attention. It really has to be made clear here that there's no reliable evidence that she ever took it beyond flirting, but that may not be terribly important. And with Henry now giving his attention to Jane, Anne might have been a little more welcoming of the attention of the male courtiers. This would be the seed that gave birth to the idea of how to get rid of Queen Anne. It's unknown when Cromwell came up with the idea to frame Anne for adultery. After all, this was a deadly game, and if discovered, Cromwell could be hanged for treason. If it succeeded, it would be Anne losing her head. He would carefully cover his tracks. Some argue that there's no solid evidence showing that Cromwell was the conspirator, but of all of Anne's enemies at court, he was the one in the best position to stage the Queen's crimes. In 1537, Cromwell went missing from royal court for just over a week. During that time, he was gathering evidence against Anne. He bribed some of Anne's ladies in waitings, had spies in the Queen's living quarters, and gathered stories about the Queen's infidelities. Most of these stories were either exaggerated or harmless flirtations that had been blown out of proportion. Cromwell even kept everything from the king, keeping the king in the dark until he felt he had enough evidence to convince the king to act. How much of a push Henry really needed is not clear. At this point, he was ready and able to move on from Anne. Maybe not ready to have her killed, but clearly he had moved on to Jane Seymour at this time. When Cromwell presented his case to Henry, he ordered Cromwell to launch the investigation.
Let's be real. Henry already had his, I'll say, mistress again lined up. so it probably didn't take much convincing. Cromwell could have handed him a half baked rumor, and Henry would have said, "Sounds like treason, so go dig something up."
Hmm. Among the first questioned was Mark Smeaton. Smeaton was described as young and naive. He most likely had no idea that flirting with the Queen was as dangerous as it was. He might have even thought that a truthful denial would get him out of trouble. But when an inquisitor wants a confession, he's going to get a confession. Smeaton, almost certainly under torture, gave a full confession to the adulterous affair with Anne Boleyn. When Henry was told of the confession, he ordered that everything be kept quiet for the time being. Anne, for her part, seemed totally unaware of what was happening. Quickly, others were accused and brought in for questioning. This would eventually include Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. The two had always been close, and now that closeness was used as evidence of incest. More and more men were arrested, most of whom had some type of beef with Cromwell. It was proving to be a great way to get rid of as many of his enemies in the royal court as possible. Finally, on the 2nd of May, 1536, Anne herself was arrested and sent to the Tower of London to await trial. Cromwell was also able to isolate the king, preventing any of Anne's supporters from speaking with Henry. When Anne wrote an elegant letter to Henry in her defense, Cromwell intercepted the letter. It's unknown if he ever passed it on to Henry.
I'm betting not. Why would he intercept it if he was going to give it to the king anyways?
Fair point. The trial was a foregone conclusion. Charged not just with adultery, but also with plotting to kill the king and incest, she would be sentenced to death. All the charges and evidence were read aloud in court. She refuted the charges, swearing her loyalty to her husband and king, but the jury knew there was only one acceptable outcome, and Anne was found guilty of high treason and sentenced to beheading. Henry would show one bizarre act of compassion. He took the extra expense to hire an expert swordsman from Calais to behead Anne. This would hopefully ensure one quick, clean blow. Reportedly, Anne told Sir William Kensington, "I hear the executioner is very good, and I have a little neck," and then placed her hands around her neck and laughed. At the time of the execution, it's reported that Anne went to the blocks showing great dignity and calm. She was beheaded on the 19th of May, 1536. Henry and Jane married just 11 days later.
Wow. If I die before you, you better wait longer than 11 days or I will haunt you forever.
Yeah, I promise you 12.
Hey,
At first, things worked out for Cromwell. He got in good with the new queen. His son even married Jane Seymour's sister, making him an in law to the king. But it didn't last long. Jane died in 1537, just days after giving birth to Henry's only surviving son, Edward VI, who would sit on the throne for a very short time before his more famous sisters would take over. Then Cromwell fell out of Henry's favor. In 1540, he was executed for high treason. And in a true act of karma, his execution was rumored to have gone horribly wrong, requiring multiple swings of the axe.
serves him right.
Henry would go on to have 6 wives in total before dying himself in 1547, a bloated shadow of the man he once was. His wives, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, as English school children use a mnemonic device to remember their fates. Unlike us Americans, sometimes believe he didn't chop the heads off all of his wives, only one third.
Only one third. How kind.
3 of his children would take the throne of England. Edward was sickly. His only son would have a short reign, primarily controlled by regents. Then his eldest daughter, Mary, aka Bloody Mary, would try to reestablish the Catholic Church in England by murdering thousands of Protestants. And finally, Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, would become one of the greatest monarchs in English history, but died childless, ending the Tudor dynasty. Maybe after her family's history, she thought it was best not to have children. This has been History is Criminal. Come back next week as Kimberly and I take a look at the Missouri Kid, or Missouri, I suppose, if you're a big enough hick. And as usual, if you like what you heard, tell a friend, and if not, tell an enemy. Never suffer alone.